Live coverage on C-SPAN beginning at 7 Eastern. Following the joint session, the Senate will reconvene to vote on whether to proceed to resolution of disapproval over raising the debt ceiling. We now take you to the Senate floor for live coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Lord God, through whom we find liberty and peace, lead us in your righteousness and make the way straight before our lawmakers. As they grapple with complex issues and feel the need for guidance, lead them to the decisions that will best glorify you. Looking to you to guide them, may they not be overwhelmed, remembering that in everything you are working for the good of those who love you. May your good blessings continue to be with us, and may we, in response to your abiding love, ever seek to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with you. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., September 8, 2011. To the Senate. Under provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Tom Udall, a senator from the state of New Mexico, to perform the duties of the chair, son Daniel K. Inouye, President Pro Tempore.
Mr. President.
Majority leaders recognized.
Following any leader remarks, there will be an hour of morning business. Republicans will control the first half, majority control the final half. Following morning business, Senate will resume consideration of the American Invents Act. There will be 4 roll call votes starting about 4 p.m. That time could move a little bit, but not much. And we're doing that in order to complete action on this patent bill. It's been so important to the country. It'll be the first revision of this law in more than 6 decades. Senators should gather in the Senate chamber about 6:30 this evening to proceed as a body to the House for the joint session with President Obama. When we return this evening, there will be an additional roll call vote on the motion to proceed to S.J. Res. 25, which is a joint resolution of disapproval regarding the debt limit increase. As I indicated to everyone last night, if the motion to proceed prevails, then we'll be back tomorrow to complete that work, and that could take as much as 10 hours tomorrow. If the motion to proceed fails, then we will have other things to do tomorrow, but there will be no votes. Mr. President, I'm told that S.J. Res. 26 is due for a second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S.J. Res. 26, Joint Resolution expressing the sense of Congress that the Secretary of the Treasury, Timothy Geithner, no longer holds the confidence of Congress or of the people of the United States.
Mr. President, I would object to any further proceedings with respect to this resolution.
Objection is heard. The bill will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President, tonight before a joint session of Congress, President Obama will address the nation. from the single most important issue facing our country, the unemployment crisis that we have before us. I look forward to hearing the specifics of his plan. I've spoken to him, and I have a pretty good idea of what he's going to talk about. I support its goal to create good jobs for the 14 million people who have no jobs. And this is a time of dark economic times, and it's important we do this. I applaud the common-sense bipartisan approach he will unveil tonight to invest in badly needed infrastructure, to cut taxes for working families and small businesses, to spur job creation. These are ideas which members of both parties should rally. Republicans have always supported tax cuts. They've done it in the past, and they've agreed that we must bring America's infrastructure up to the 21st century standards. I hope that, in fact, is the case. But if my Republican friends oppose these proposals now that they've supported in the past, the reason will be very clear. It's simply partisan politics. The Republicans seem convinced that a failing economy is good for their politics. They think if they kill every jobs bill and stall every effort to revive the economy, President Obama will lose. My good friend, the Republican leader, has said so. He said the Republican Party's #1 goal of this Congress is to defeat the president. But Republicans aiming at the president have caught innocent Americans in the crossfire. This week, Republican leaders have said they want to work with the president and Democrats in Congress. They want to do this on bipartisan job creation, they say. And I hope that, in fact, is the case. Mr. President, their actions over the last 8 months speak much louder than the words of the last few days. For example, Republicans opposed the reauthorization of the Small Business Innovation Research Program and the Economic Development Administration. Both have proven track records of spurring innovation, encouraging entrepreneurship, and creating jobs. But Republicans were willing to put more than 500,000 Americans' jobs at risk and, in fact, eliminate those jobs rather than work with us to pass that legislation. The Senate passed much-needed patent reform in March. Yet, House Republicans have stalled for months before sending us back their version of the bill, which we'll vote on today. And I'm hopeful that we can send it back to the House untouched. Republicans wasted weeks threatening to shut down the economy this spring. They held our economy hostage for months this summer over a routine vote on whether to pay the nation's bills. Congress took the same vote 18 times while President Reagan was president and 7 times while George W. Bush was president. Never was the vote time-consuming or contentious. And through it all, Republicans have hacked away at funding for the very programs that were helping to get this nation's economy back on its feet. The results of their tactics, their stall tactics, obstructionism, and mindless budget cuts are beginning to show. Although the private sector created jobs for the 18th month in a row, August saw no change in the national unemployment rate. Unemployment in Nevada is still the highest in the nation. But, you know, even in spite of all this, Mr. President, Republicans refuse and have refused to allow us to focus on employment. As Democrats introduced jobs bill after jobs bill, Republicans made it clear they were more interested in pursuing a political agenda than a jobs agenda. But we'll no longer allow them to put politics ahead of the American people. There are 2 things we must get done this work period. Both these things will create and save jobs immediately. We must reauthorize the Federal Aviation Administration to protect both air travelers and airline workers. That's 80,000 jobs. And we must pass a highway bill to fund construction projects across the nation. These 2 bills combined will save about 2 million jobs, including many jobs in the struggling construction industry, and it will do it now. But we need Republican help. We can't get it done without them. This is their chance to prove they remember the word bipartisan. It's time for necessity to trump ideology. Senator Robert Byrd once said, quote, "Potholes know no parties. Challenges that face this nation today are greater than any speed bump, but the road to recovery is the same, cooperation. Partisanship will not solve our jobs crisis, but setting aside politics and service to our country certainly will." Mr. President, we've been able to move forward this week and get some things done. I appreciate very much. the work especially of Senator Kyle, who is the Republican whip, in working to put the patent bill in a position that it's in so that we can finish that bill today. We certainly hope to be able to do that. His work has been very, very exemplary, and I appreciate it very, very much. Next week, likely, our first vote will be to do something about FEMA, which is broke. Federal Emergency Management Agency. We've had a string of natural catastrophes that have been just awful. Irene, Lee, tornadoes don't have names, but the one that struck Joplin, Missouri, killed almost 200 people and devastated that town. I went down here in S-120 last night, and they had a number of scientists who were showing some of the things that they've developed. One of the things they developed, Mr. President, is that these are things that they did at universities, handmade pieces of magnificent equipment that does many things. One of the things they have is something that they can place in the path of a storm. They've never been able to do that before. Determine how what the direction of the wind is, how hard it blows, without belaboring the point. One of the instruments there recorded the strongest winds ever recorded in the history of the world, more than 300 miles an hour. And that's basically what we had in Joplin, Missouri. There's no building that can withstand that. It's devastating. And the pictures you see of Joplin, Missouri is like a series of bombs hit that community. Every building was affected, most of them knocked down. The reason I mention that, Mr. President, FEMA has stopped work in Joplin, Missouri. People were there working for $9 an hour, just putting things back in a semblance of order. That work has stopped. FEMA has had now to look at the places that are impacted right now. They're still trying to get the water out of some of the places because of Lee. They're trying to restore some of the immediate damage because of Irene. We have to do something to replenish that money. I was happy to see some of the statements from one of the Republican leaders in the House yesterday, in effect changing his position on that all this has to be paid for. We have, as we speak, Mr. President, we're spending billions and billions of dollars every week in Iraq and Afghanistan. I understand that. But that's all unpaid for. Unpaid for. Certainly couldn't we do something to help American people? That's an emergency. Figure out some other way in the in the future to look forward to other disasters. We try to pre-fund what we think disasters are going to be. But these are acts of God. That's what we learn in law school. These hurricanes, these tornadoes, these floods. And along the Mississippi River, Mr. President, we have more than 3 million acres that are underwater. This is farmland. It's not just vacant land. It's farmland that's underwater. These people need help. We are the ones that can help them. We need to do that. So that's why we're going to have a vote as soon as I can arrange it next week on funding FEMA so they can continue doing the work that's so important for our country. Note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader is recognized.
I ask that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, later on today, both houses of Congress will welcome President Obama to the Capitol to speak about a very serious crisis we face as a nation, namely an economic climate that is making it impossible for millions of Americans to find the work they need to support themselves and their families. Now, in a two-party system like ours, it shouldn't be surprising that there would be two very different points of view about how to solve this particular crisis. What is surprising is the President's apparent determination to apply the same government-driven policies that have already been tried and failed. The definition of insanity, Albert Einstein once famously put it, is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. Frankly, I can't think of a better description of anyone who thinks the solution to the problem is another stimulus. The first stimulus didn't do it. Why would another one? This is one question that the White House and a number of Democrats clearly don't want to answer. That's why some of them are out there coaching people not to use the word stimulus when describing the President's plan. Others are accusing anybody who criticizes it of being unpatriotic or playing politics. Well, as I've said before, there is a much simpler reason to oppose the President's economic policies that has nothing whatsoever to do with politics. They simply don't work. Yet, by all accounts, the President's so-called jobs plan is to try those very same policies again and then accuse anyone who doesn't support them this time around of being political or overly partisan, of not doing what's needed in this moment of crisis. This isn't a jobs plan, it's a re-election plan. That's why Republicans will continue to press for policies that empower job creators, not Washington. According to the Wall Street Journal, nearly a third of the unemployed have been out of work for more than a year. The average length of unemployment is now greater than 40 weeks, higher than it was even during the Great Depression. As we know, the longer you're out of a job, the harder it is to find one. That means for millions of Americans, this crisis is getting harder every day. It's getting worse and worse. And we also know this: the economic policies of this President have not alleviated the problem. In many ways, in fact, they've made things worse. Gas prices are up, the national debt is up, health insurance premiums are up, home values in most places continue to fall, and 2.5 years after the President's signature jobs bill was signed into law, 1.7 fewer Americans have jobs. So I'd say that Americans have 1.7 million reasons to oppose another stimulus. And that's why many of us have been calling on the President to propose something entirely different tonight. Not because of politics, but because the kind of policies he's proposed in the past haven't worked. The problem here isn't politics. The problem is the policy. It's time the President starts thinking less about how to describe his policies differently and more time thinking about devising new policies. And he might start by working with Congress instead of writing it in secret without any consultation with Republicans, a plan that the White House is calling bipartisan. With 14 million Americans out of work, job creation should be a no-politics zone. And Republicans stand ready to act on policies that get the private sector moving again. What we're reluctant to do, however, is to allow the President to put us deeper in debt to finance a collection of short-term fixes or shots in the arm that might move the needle today but which deny American job creators the things they really need to solve the crisis: predictability, stability, fewer government burdens, and less red tape. Because while this crisis may have persisted for far too long and caused far too much hardship, one thing we do have right now is the benefit of hindsight. We know what doesn't work. So tonight the President should take a different approach. should acknowledge the failures of an economic agenda that centers on government, spending, and debt, and work across the aisle on a plan that puts people and businesses at the forefront of job creation. If the American people are going to have control over their own destiny, they need to have more control over their economy. That means shifting the center of gravity away from Washington and toward those who really create jobs. It means putting an end to the regulatory overreach that's holding job creators back. It means being as bold about liberating job creators as the administration's been about shackling them. It means reforming an outdated tax code and getting out of the business of picking winners and losers. It means lowering the U.S. corporate tax rate, which is currently the second highest in the world. And it means leveling the playing field with our competitors overseas by approving free trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea that have been languishing on the President's desk literally for years. Contrary to the President's claims, this economic approach isn't aimed at pleasing any one party or constituency. It's aimed at giving back to the American people the tools they need to do the work that Washington has not been able to do on its own, despite its best efforts over the past few years. Now, the President's free to blame his political adversaries, his predecessor, or even natural disasters for America's economic challenges. Tonight, he may blame any future challenges on those who choose not to rubber stamp his latest proposals. But it should be noted that this is precisely what Democratic majorities did during the President's first 2 years in office. And look where that got us. But here's the bottom line. By the President's own standards, his jobs agenda has been a failure, and we can't afford to make the same mistake twice. Now, after the President's speech tonight calling for more stimulus spending, the Senate will vote on his request for an additional $500 billion increase in the debt ceiling. So senators will have an opportunity to vote for or against this type of approach right away. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half.
Mr. President.
Senator from Nebraska is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have come to the floor many times, as we all do, to discuss issues that are important to our states, in my case the state of Nebraska, and issues that are important to our nation. Many times those comments deal with what seems to be the constant regulatory assault on our nation's job creators. In meetings across Nebraska, and I did 15 town hall meetings in August, the second and third questions I often get, if not the very first, concern the regulatory burden that our federal agencies are placing on our job creators. This administration has generated nothing short of a mountain of red tape, hundreds of new regulations. Of these, at least 219 have been categorized as significant. What that means is that they will cost more than $100 million per year. $100 million taken out of our economy to finance regulation. The administration doesn't even dispute the mountain of red tape, nor does it dispute the size of the mountain that is created. In a letter from the President to Speaker Boehner, the White House identified 7 regulations on its agenda, each costing not $100 million, but at least $1 billion per year. These costs take important capital out of our economy. These costs weigh on our job creators. These costs punish the little guy, and there's no doubt about it. And this mountain is so massive, the administration has had to expand the federal workforce itself just to write the regulations and to enforce them. Employment at federal agencies is up 13% since President Obama took office. So with unemployment in excess of 9%, underemployment greater than that, this administration is expanding the size of government just to fuel more job-suppressing restrictions. And it just makes no sense. It makes no sense to me as an individual senator, but it makes no sense to the people of Nebraska. For this reason, I am introducing legislation with the senior senator from Arizona to press the pause button on this massive wave of red tape before it engulfs our very economy. Our legislation is very straightforward. It says our small businesses are getting crushed. Our citizens can't find jobs. Freeze the regulatory onslaught through 2013. But our work simply cannot stop there. We also need some targeted regulatory reforms to rein in government bureaucracies that are simply out of control. Thus, I will also be introducing two other pieces of additional legislation today to help temper the endless quest for additional power, jurisdiction, and therefore regulation. The first one would close a loophole that allows agencies to grab power without authority, to grab power without an opportunity for congressional review. Under the current state of the law, the Congressional Review Act permits Congress to use special procedures to step in and to disapprove agency rules. However, in this administration, agencies have recently chosen to use what they call guidance documents instead of rules to achieve their policy preferences and to expand their power. I'm troubled by this trend because their efforts appear to deliberately, intentionally circumvent American law specifically crafted to protect citizens from aggressive bureaucracies. We have an example, but there are many. I'd like to use this one. I'm talking about a guidance document issued jointly by EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers on May 2nd of this year. It's very recent. The guidance document's goal is clear: to expand federal power over waterways. Don't take my word for it. According to the EPA's own analysis, the guidance would significantly expand the waters of the United States subject to federal control and regulation. The American Farm Bureau has said the guidance, quote, defines jurisdiction in the broadest way possible, unquote. Well, this is a page straight out of this administration's playbook. If their policy goal is rejected by Congress, they use their regulatory power to accomplish their agenda any way they can. Stretch the law, ignore the law, claim that the statute is ambiguous, circumvent it, put out a guidance document to interpret it, and that's exactly what they're doing. We've seen this playbook used over and over again by this administration and its federal agencies. They should have gotten the message after an unsuccessful attempt during the last Congress to vastly expand their jurisdiction over virtually all waters from irrigation ditches to farm ponds. But like a child that hears no from his parents, they jump ahead. The administration went ahead anyway through this guidance document. As the North Dakota Farm Bureau president described it, EPA's guidance is an end run around Congress. And I'm quoting, "If you can't get what you want with Congress' blessing, make an end around them." That seems to be what is happening here. And make no mistake, if this guidance is adopted, EPA could regulate any of the waters found in a state, no matter how small or seemingly unconnected to a federal interest, unquote. The agencies could not convince Congress to change the law. So now what is happening? the same goal is being pursued in a different way that bypasses us. Notably, both the House and the Senate have expressed strong concern about the guidance document. 20 senators sent a letter noting that it represents a dramatic expansion of federal power over private land. In another letter, 41 senators asserted that making changes to the scope of the agency's activities through guidance instead of through rulemaking is, quote, fundamentally unfair, unquote. This letter requested the agencies, again quoting, abandon any further action on this guidance document, unquote. This is a very significant concern. This guidance document also has shown us that there is a huge loophole through which agencies can circumvent the rulemaking process in its entirety, as well as circumventing congressional intent in order to expand federal power. So the legislation I introduced today closes the loophole. It amends the Congressional Review Act to cover both traditional rules and guidance documents. No more end run around Congress. Consequently, agencies would be on notice that the loophole through which they intend to circumvent our will and the will of the American public is now a closed door. In other words, citizens would have another layer of protection from agencies seeking to unfairly expand federal jurisdiction. Finally, today I'm introducing the Farm Dust Regulation Prevention Act. Farmers and ranchers across this nation are concerned about the EPA's efforts to regulate dust. Despite what the administrator is saying in farm country, EPA is still in the midst of their review of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for particulate matter, or put simply, farm dust. In rural America, farm dust is a fact of life. I grew up on a farm. It's dusty there. We kick it up while driving on unpaved roads or working in farm fields. Farm dust has long been considered to have no health concern at ambient levels. However, EPA is considering bringing down the hammer by ratcheting down that standard to a level that would be economically devastating for many in our rural areas. That just defies common sense. While to restore common sense to these burdensome, job-threatening regulations and to give certainty to rural America, I'm introducing this legislation. The bill simply says no to EPA from regulating dust in rural America, yet it maintains the protections of the Clean Air Act to public health. It provides immediate certainty to farmers in rural areas by preventing revision of the current dust standard for a year. Afterward, EPA could regulate farm dust, but only if they followed a scientific standard. First, they'd need to show scientific evidence of substantial adverse health effects caused by dust. Thus far, the strongest the EPA can conjure up in terms of science is to say it's uncertain. And second, EPA would need to show that the benefit of additional regulation outweighs economic costs. These are common sense standards. Yet the EPA has unfortunately been unable to see the light, making this legislation necessary. So there's three common sense regulatory reforms that are sorely needed. A 2-year moratorium on job-constraining regulations. Number 2, making agency guidance documents subject.
Senator's time has expired.
May I ask for an additional 1 minute?
Without objection.
Making agency guidance documents subject to simple up or down vote by Congress and stopping the ill-advised farm dust regulation. They would provide much certainty and relief for our nation's job creators and our American workers. I urge my colleagues to co-sponsor these important efforts. I urge the White House to support us. The runaway train of regulation is weighing down on America's ingenuity and job creation. It's time to unshackle American workers with these common sense reforms. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I would like to congratulate the senator from Nebraska on his typically common sense, reasonable presentation about how we might take steps to deal with the smothering regulations that are putting a big wet blanket on job growth in this country. I mean, the idea of a timeout to stop the avalanche of new regulations makes sense. Farm dust, the idea of regulating farm dust makes no sense. Slowing down the ability of federal agencies to get around the regulatory process by issuing guidance, that makes common sense. These are three sensible steps that would help create an environment that would make it easier and cheaper for job creators to create private sector jobs in this country, and I congratulate the senator from Nebraska for his comments. Mr. President, I believe I have up to 20 minutes.
There's 16 and a half minutes remaining on the side.
Would you please let me know when 5 minutes remain?
When 5 minutes are remaining?
Yes.
Yes.
I thank the chair. Mr. President, tonight we welcome President Obama to the Congress to deliver a jobs address. The President will be coming at a time when we have had persistent unemployment at a greater rate than at any time since the Great Depression. No one should blame our President for problems with an economy that he inherited. But the President does have the responsibility for taking responsibility for making the economy worse. Unemployment is up. The debt is up. Housing values are down. And the morning paper reports that we may be on our way, at least the chances are 50-50, the newspaper says this morning, to a double-dip recession. The number of unemployed Americans is up about 2 million since the President took office. The amount of federal debt is up about 4 million. As I just mentioned in discussing the senator from Nebraska's proposals, the President's policies, rather than helping over the last 2.5 years, have thrown a big wet blanket over private sector job creation. They've made it more expensive and more difficult for the private sector to create jobs for Americans. Let me be specific about that. The President chose 2 years ago, rather than to focus exclusively on jobs, to focus on health care. And his proposal was to expand a health care delivery system that already cost too much, that was already too expensive. So we have new health care taxes and mandates that make the economy worse. Why do I say that? I met, for example, with the chief executive officers of several of the nation's largest restaurant companies. They reminded me that those restaurants and hospitality organizations in the United States are the largest employer outside of government, and that their employees are mostly young and mostly low income. One of the chief executives said because of the mandates of the health care law, it would take all of his profits from last year to pay the costs when it's fully implemented, so he won't be investing in any new restaurants in the United States. Another said they operate with 90 employees per store, but as a result of the mandates and taxes in the health care law, their goal will be to operate with 70 employers per store. Well, if the largest employers are saying instead of having 90 employees per store, we're going to have 70, that doesn't help create new jobs in the United States. Or let's take the debt. The President inherited debt, but he's made it worse. And the economists who look at debt say we're heading toward a level that will cost us in the United States 1 million jobs every year. Undermining the right-to-work law. The President's appointees to the National Labor Relations Board have told the nation's largest manufacturers of large airplanes that they can't build a plant in South Carolina. It's the first new plant to build large airplanes in 40 years in this country. Well, the Boeing company can It sells those airplanes everywhere in the world. It could build them everywhere in the world. We want to build them in the United States. Those kinds of actions by the National Labor Relations Board makes it worse. Regulations that put a big wet blanket over job creation, such as the one that the senator from Nebraska talks about, make it worse. The President's refusal to send trade agreements to Congress make it worse. Let's be clear about this. Since the day the President took office, he's had on his desk 3 trade agreements already signed by both countries. They simply need approval by our Congress. One with Panama, one with South Korea, one with Colombia. We're ready to approve them in a bipartisan way, if you'll send them here. And what would that mean in Tennessee? We make a lot of auto parts in Tennessee. We could sell them to South Korea. At the present time, Europeans can sell them to South Korea at a lower price because of the tariff situation, because the President hadn't sent the 3 trade agreements to Congress. So all these steps have made the economy worse. And of course, with the bad economy, home values have stayed down. That's worse too. So what can we do about this? What are the kinds of things the President could talk about tonight and that we could work on together to make it easier and cheaper to create private sector jobs? We could change the tax structure in a permanent way, not short-term fixes, but long-term lowering of tax rates for everyone, closing loopholes, creating a situation where our businesses are more competitive in the world marketplace. That's one thing we could do. We could stop the avalanche of regulations that are throwing the big wet blanket over job growth. The senator from Nebraska suggested a moratorium on new regulations, avoiding guidances, as he suggested, that circumvent the rules for regulations, stopping wacky ideas like regulating farm dust, as if everybody didn't know that all farms create dust. More exports. The President could send today the 3 trade agreements to Congress. We could ratify them, and then crops grown in Tennessee and Nebraska and every other state in this country, and auto parts and medical devices grown could be sold around the world. Our state alone has $23 billion and tens of thousands of jobs tied up in exports. This could add to that. And in addition to that, we could agree on advanced research. The President's recommendations have been good on that. But we should agree on that and move ahead with appropriations bills and a fiscal situation that permits us to do the kind of advanced research we need to do to create jobs. We need to fix No Child Left Behind. Better schools mean better jobs. We need a long-term highway bill. We need roads and bridges in order to have the kind of country we want. We need to find more American energy and use less. We should be able to agree on that. There's an agenda, not of more spending, not of more taxes, not of more regulation, but an agenda that would make it easier and cheaper to create private sector jobs and get the economy moving again. Mr. President, in another time, a president named Eisenhower said, "I shall go to Korea," and he was elected president. He went to Korea before he was inaugurated, and then he said, I shall focus my time on this single objective until I see it all the way through to the end. The country felt good about that. They had confidence in him. He did that, and the Korean War was ended. President Obama chose, instead of focusing on jobs 2.5 years ago in the same sort of presidential way, to expand a health care delivery system that already was too expensive and, in fact, make the problem worse. Tonight is an opportunity to make it better, and we're ready to join with him in doing that, especially if he were to recommend lower tax rates, fewer loopholes on a permanent basis, fewer regulations, and if he were to send those 3 export agreements to us to ratify. Now, Mr. President, I would like to turn my attention to a different subject. September 11 is Sunday. I listened carefully, as most of us in the Senate do, to words that seem to resonate with my audiences. I have consistently found there is just one sentence that I usually cannot finish without the audience interrupting me by breaking into applause, and it is this. It is time to put the teaching of American history and civics back in its rightful place in our schools so our children can grow up learning what it means to be an American. The terrorists who attacked us on September 11 weren't just lashing out at buildings and people. They were attacking who we are as Americans. Most Americans know this, and that's why there's been a national hunger for leadership and discussion about our values. Parents know that our children aren't being taught our common culture and our values. National tests show that 3/4 of the nation's 4th, 8th, and 12th graders are not proficient in civics knowledge, and 1/3 don't even have basic knowledge, making them civic illiterates. That's why I made making American history and civics the subject of my maiden speech when I first came to the Senate in 2003, and by a vote of 90-0, the Senate passed my bill to create summer residential academies for outstanding teachers of American history and civics. Every year I bring them on the Senate floor, and those teachers from all over our country have a moment to think about this Senate. They usually go find the desk of the senator from Alaska, if they're an Alaska teacher, or the senator from Tennessee, or Daniel Webster's desk, or Jefferson Davis's desk, and they stop for a moment and think about our country in a special way. Those teachers' purpose is better teaching, and the purpose of the Academy is more learning of key events, key persons, key ideas, and key documents that shape the institutions and the democratic heritage of the United States. So if I were teaching about September 11, these are some of the issues I would ask my students to consider. Number one, is September 11 the worst thing that ever happened to the United States? Of course, the answer is no. But I'm surprised by the number of people who say yes. It saddens me to realize that those who make such statements were never properly taught about American history. Many doubted that we would win the Revolutionary War. The British sacked Washington and burned the White House to the ground in the War of 1812. In the Civil War, we lost more Americans than in any other conflict, with brother fighting against brother. The list goes on. Children should know why we made those sacrifices and fought for the values that make us exceptional. Second question I would talk about is what makes America exceptional. I began the first session of a course I taught at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government 10 or 11 years ago by making a list of 100 ways that America is exceptional. Unique, not always better, but unique. America's exceptionalism has been a source of fascination ever since de Tocqueville's trip across America in 1830, when he met both Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie on his trip. His book, Democracy in America, is still the best description of America's unique ideals in action. Another outstanding text is American Exceptionalism by Seymour Martin Lipset.
Senator has you 5 minutes remaining.
I thank the chair. A third question I would ask my students is, why is it you can't become Japanese or French, but you must become an American? If I were to immigrate to Japan, I couldn't become a Japanese. I would always be an American living in Japan. But if I were a Japanese citizen who came here and I wanted to become a citizen, I would have to become an American. And we would welcome that person with open arms. Why? It's because our identity is not based on ethnicity, but on a creed of ideas and values in which most of us believe. Historian Richard Hofstadter wrote, "It is our fate as a nation not to have ideologies, but to be one." To become American citizens, immigrants must take a test demonstrating their knowledge of American history and civics. Fourth, what are the principles that unite us as Americans? In Thanksgiving remarks after September 11, President George W. Bush praised our nation's response to terror. "I call it the American character," he said. Former Vice President Gore, in a speech after the attacks, said, "We should fight for the values that bind us together as a country." In my Harvard course that I mentioned, we put together a list of some of those values: liberty, e pluribus unum, equal opportunity, individualism, rule of law, free exercise of religion, separation of church and state, laissez-faire, and the belief in progress, the idea that anyone can do anything, anything is possible. If we agree on those principles, I would then say to my student, then why is there so much division in American politics? Well, just because we agree on the values doesn't mean we agree on how to apply those values. Most of our politics, in fact, is about the hard work of applying those principles to our everyday lives. When they do, we often conflict. For example, when discussing President Bush's proposals to let the federal government fund faith-based charities, we know that in God we trust. We have it here in the Senate. But we also know we don't trust government with God. When considering whether the federal government should pay for scholarships that middle and low-income families might use at any accredited school, public, private, or religious, some object that the principle of equal opportunity can conflict with the principle of separation of church and state. And then, what does it mean to be an American? After September 11, I proposed an idea I call Pledge Plus 3. Why not start each school day with a Pledge of Allegiance, as many schools still do, and then ask a teacher or a student to take 3 minutes and explain what it means to be an American? I'll bet the best 3-minute statements of what it means to be an American would come from the newest Americans. At least that was the case with my university students who I taught. The newest Americans appreciated it the most and could talk about it the best. Ask students to stand and raise their right hand and recite the oath of allegiance, just as immigrants do when they become American citizens. This is an oath that goes all the way back to the days of George Washington and Valley Forge. It reads like it was written in a tavern by a bunch of patriots in Williamsburg late one night. I recited this with my right hand up during a speech I recently gave on American history and civics. It's quite a weighty thing, and it startles the audience to say, I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure any allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, and agree to bear arms on behalf of the United States when required by law. The oath to become an American taken by George Washington and his men, taken today in courthouses all across America, is a solemn, weighty matter. Mr. President, our history is a struggle to live up to the ideas that have united us and that have defined us from the very beginning, the principles of what we call the American character. If that is what students are taught about September 11, they will not only become better informed, they will strengthen our country for generations to come. I thank the President. I yield the floor. And I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Thank you.